science and music really change hearts and minds? Yes, it can. This is a heartwarming story from Malaysia about how a scientist and a theatre director came together to produce a genre-defying performance piece using Malaysian gamelan music to serenade the cause of seagrass. And it inspired their audiences to take action for the protection of this previously overlooked marine plant. This is the MetroWild podcast, where we celebrate city life and wild nature. I'm your host, Yang-May Ooi. My guests today are Jillian Ooi and Zahim Albakri. Jillian Ooi shares my surname, but we're not related. Jillian Ooi is a marine ecologist at the Department of Geography, University Malaya in Malaysia. Her research focuses on seagrass, a vital but often overlooked flowering plant that grows in shallow coastal seas. She's deeply concerned about the decline of seagrass ecosystems in Malaysia. To educate the public about its importance, she uses the power of music to amplify her scientific work and inspire action for seagrass conservation. When Jillian is not underwater watching grass grow, she plays the gamelan and is the artistic director and music director of Rhythm in Bronze, an award-winning Malaysian gamelan orchestra. Datuk Zahim Albakri, which is the Malaysian equivalent of Sir Zahim Albakri, was born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He was educated in the UK and then returned to Malaysia to pursue a career in acting and directing. As the artistic director of Drama Lab since 1993, he focuses on nurturing new Malaysian writing for theatre. Zahim's accolades include numerous awards for acting and directing, notably for his feature film debut, Spilt Gravy, which received 7 awards at the 2022 Malaysian Film Festival, and is available to most international audiences on Netflix. He is also committed to cultural preservation and holds positions in the Heritage Trust of Malaysia. Seruan Setu, or The Call of the Seagrass, is their multimedia, multi-genre performance piece telling the story of seagrass that premiered in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in 2023. It uses film, dance, gamelan music and TED Talk-style presentations to take audiences on an enchanting musical journey that spotlights Malaysia's endangered seagrass ecosystems. Jillian Ooi, what was your inspiration for the Seruan Setu concert theatre piece?
Seruan Setu, translated into Malay, means call of the seagrass. And we wanted to evoke this imagery of the seagrass being, this beautiful, mysterious ecosystem that people didn't know very much about, but would fall in love with if they would only heed its call. And what inspired it was a sense of urgency that we are running out of time. We are losing seagrass meadows globally, but more so here in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. We are losing it at a rate faster than we can protect and conserve it. So I feel this sense of urgency and fear as a seagrass scientist. And every time I go out into the field in the seagrass meadows that I love so much, I always wonder, what if I were to bring my performing arts friends here, my musicians and directors and choreographers and poets? Imagine what magic they could work to be able to convince people that this is really, a worthwhile ecosystem to protect and to put greater conservation attention into. And Seruan Setu, it was designed for that. It was designed for us to use the language of gamelan music in this case, and the art of theatre making, to communicate scientific facts about seagrass in a way that resonates with people, to make them feel something about the ecosystem.
So can you tell us a little bit more about gamelan music for our international audience?
Yes, gamelan music, the gamelan is an orchestra that is unique to Southeast Asia. It's made out of bronze instruments. Some of them look like pots. Some of them look like suspended gongs. And musicians create melodies or rhythms by striking those pots or gongs with beaters. So it's actually a percussive ensemble, basically. And I've been playing it for, wow, well, almost 20 years now. It's an orchestra that it's the type of music that I fell in love with. I used to play the piano, the guitar, and the tabla. And once I learned the gamelan, I dropped all those other instruments because teamwork is so integral in gamelan music. And that's something that I really enjoyed.
And so you said, if only I could bring all my creative friends to see the seagrass. How do you actually go and see seagrass?
Well, okay. The first, there's the type there that is always submerged underwater, and you'd have to be a scuba diver or a very good snorkeler to see that kind of seagrass. But then there's also intertidal seagrass meadows where when the tide goes down really, really low once a month, you can actually walk on the seagrass meadow as if walking in the garden,
Wow.
And it's fascinating, the things that you'll see like crabs trying to get away from you, as you're walking on the meadow. So you can literally walk out to the seagrass meadow from shore. In some areas, you take a short boat ride out and then you step out of the boat, like into the seagrass meadow, and walk in the garden.
Now, Zahim Albakri, you're one of Jillian's theatre friends. Can you describe when you saw the seagrass for the first time yourself? What was your experience of that?
It looks like grass. It really does. There's a type of seagrass, which is the long seagrass, which is the Setu, actually. The Setu. It looks a bit like lalang, which is a Malaysian type of grass, which grows like everywhere and unkept places and not very treasured in any way, lalang. And so seagrass does look at times like submerged lalang. But it's when you step into it, everything kind of changes and you start noticing this whole other garden of grass. There's all kinds of creatures and all sorts of other things going. It's really quite fascinating, but it's odd when you have to walk in a particular way with the booties that you wear with and you walk in a particular way, which is kind of odd, not the way you normally walk. You put kind of toes in first. You had your head down, looking down at the seagrass almost the whole time. So it's sort of odd when you see people walking around seagrass. But what you see is extraordinary, and there's all kinds of life. There's the sea cucumbers and you get seahorses, crabs, prawns. They call it the nurseries of the sea as well.
Is it okay to walk on it? Because generally when we think about conserving spaces, it's like, don't walk on the grass. What's the situation with that, Jillian?
Yes, if the point is to call attention to it and to let people experience it so that they would then agree to actually put more protection to it, then I think it is a worthwhile thing to do. However, if we have people treading on it all the time, like huge crowds going out there, that would be a problem. So that may come up to be a concern later, but not right now. Right now, people don't even know very much about seagrass, much less want to go walk on it. So this is the time that we've just got to bring people out there to make them fall in love with it first.
So now let's talk about Seruan Setu as a concert piece. What was the process for developing that initial idea into a musical theatre piece, a musical, multimedia, multi-genre concert piece? Zahim Albakri, perhaps you could talk us through that.
I had worked with Rhythm in Bronze quite some time, might have been 20 years ago. Jillian and a producer, Rhythm and Bronze, Shamini, had approached me, to direct another one of their gamelan theatre pieces. And it'd been years and years they kept asking me. And finally I kind of said, well, I think I've got time to do this. And I was looking for something to do. I hadn't directed anything since COVID. And so I met them, and then Jillian gave me the idea. And I was like, oh God, after waiting so long, you had to give me the hardest, the most challenging piece of work. We need to get the message out, and there's so much in the way that it's a concert. Is it a concert? And then is it a documentary? And I love the idea of the immersive lab, of going down and actually experiencing. And it's not just the seagrass, actually. There's so much around it as well, which is the life of the community who live off basically the fishing from seagrass. And so, seagrass is usually very close to mangrove swamps as well. So the mangrove is also connected. I knew we had to be very true to the music, to the composers, because Rhythm and Bronze's reputation is at stake in that sense. They've always performed really excellent the concerts are the pieces of absolutely fantastic. So that needed to be foremost. But then how do we inject the seagrass elements into it? I was kind of thinking, okay, what some pieces could benefit from having a visual element to it through a video. But also it's the documentary thing was most challenging, I think. We decided we would have a dance within the piece. So there was a choreographer who I haven't worked with for many, many years. Ida Redza, she's fantastic. She's one of my favorite Malaysian choreographers. I was very excited to work with her again. Raja Malik is a set designer who I work with quite often. He was brought on as the costume and set designer. It sort of evolved as we went along. And there was a really important stage to the thing. We had the immersive lab. The composers, after the immersive lab, the composers went off and composed. And then we got together and we got the help of a young director called Mark Kay, who was with Five Arts Centre, who has done a lot of pieces which are based on text or based on sometimes video interviews.
So can we just pause here, because you've used the phrase immersive lab a few times. Could you just explain what that is for our listeners? Perhaps, Jillian, that's something over to you.
Yes. So the immersive lab is an experience where we immerse people who have never experienced seagrass meadows before in the environment there. And I called it a lab because it was really a living, a live experiment with my performing arts friends, actually, to see how they would take to this experience of going out to the seagrass meadows, but in the company of fellow scientists. So I was there myself to talk about the seagrass. There was Effendi Yang-Amri from the University of Malaya also, who talked more about the animals that you can find in the seagrass meadow. And there was also Serena Rahman, who is an environmental anthropologist, who was there to talk more about the artisanal fishers, the people who use the meadows. So you had the human aspect as well. So I guess it was more of like a hands-on practical experience in seagrass, for 4 days. And they had to live, breathe, eat. So there was one meal where they could only eat things that the fishermen got from the seagrass meadow that very morning. So in order for them to learn what type of food comes from seagrasses. So that really opened their eyes, the crabs, the type of fish, the prawns that came from there. It convinced them that seagrass meadows really are the source of seafood that Malaysians love so much.
Well, and of course, being from Malaysia myself, I completely connect with this idea of, food. The first thing that Malaysians, we don't know each other, but just before the recording started, Jillian and I were starting to talk about food already. So fantastic to get people to think about seagrass through their tummies and flavors. Can we just stay with this a bit longer? And can you tell us more about how important it was to engage the local community where the seagrass grows, and in particular the people who go fishing there?
Yes, actually engaging with the local community, that's the main reason I do what I do in seagrass science. I mean, I do care about the ecosystem itself, of course. Obviously, I'm in love with seagrass meadows. I think they're beautiful, but really they're critically important in supporting the livelihoods of the fishing community, people who glean, they glean in the meadow. Gleaning is when you collect seafood with your bare hands or with very basic fishing gear, not with boats or expensive fishing gear, but literally using your own physical energy. they collect and harvest stuff from the seagrass meadow. And these are people with very low economic opportunities, meaning they're not like the rest of us who can find a living somewhere else through other means. These are the type of communities that seagrass meadows support, and that's why I find them so important. I wanted my friends from the performing arts circle to also understand that viewpoint. And so we actually had sessions where we, all of us outsiders into the community, we learned how to make nets, for example, fishing nets, as a way of getting to know the fishing community there, as they taught us their craft and about their livelihood. And after they got comfortable with us, since they were teaching us how to make fishing nets and hooks and all, then we started sharing more deeply about what seagrass ecosystems mean to them and what the threats were and how they felt about things like water pollution happening around them or land reclamation that was putting their livelihoods at risk. And I think that was one of the sessions that touched the participants in this immersive lab the most, actually.
Wow, that's a very beautiful story of different types of people coming together and understanding each other and working together towards a common, wonderful objective. Coming back to you, Zahim Albakri, can you describe for our listeners the final production? We arrive, we sit down, it starts. What do we see? What's the experience of that?
The set was very simple. We had a sort of a cyclorama, a curved screen at the back for the projection. And then the gamelan set was on the stage. I didn't want, because we were talking about the sea and nothing sort of symmetrical or ordered in that straight lines or anything. So I wanted the gamelan to be sort of organic in the placement of it. And there's something which is quite amazing about the Rhythm and Bronze Orchestra, which if you go and see them in concert, the players play all sorts of different instruments. They don't stick to one instrument through the whole piece. They will change their instrument in between the pieces. And this is something which I'd seen done in doing performance. And I didn't want it to be so obviously, I'm moving to the next instrument now. So I wanted those transitions to kind of be almost seamless. And with the help of the choreographer, we came up with sort of different ideas of how to do that, so that it made sense each time they moved. And sometimes they were fun ideas. I got them to play to be little kids chasing each other, and the costumes as well. Raja Malik actually hand painted the costume. We got them to wear sort of, I guess they call it kaftans or capes with hoods, and with the seagrass painted. And the other thing he did was this sort of random placement of the instrument on stage. He then tied it all together by actually painting these trails in between the instruments, which actually does exist in seagrass meadows, because they're dugong trails, because the dugongs feed on seagrass. That was Malik's idea of having these trails going between the instruments.
You've got music, you've got dance, you've got the documentary on the screen at the back. And then I believe, Jillian, you came on and told people about your great passion for seagrass. Is that right?
Yes, I did. That was so not my idea. I thought I would be just a musician on stage, which was something I was used to, but I didn't expect to actually be the scientist talking on stage as well, because that means that I have to memorize lines. And I'm not good at that. But Zahim and Mark K, this was their idea. So if they say jump, I have to ask how high. So yes, I had to be on stage. Zahim made me wear my lab coat on stage as a scientist speaking to people about, scientific findings about seagrass. And that was very scary, actually.
Yes.
And they described it as being mini TED Talks slipped in between all these music pieces that people wouldn't expect that. By the time they realized that our real agenda is to educate them about seagrass instead of just play them nice, pretty gamelan music, it's already too late. They're already absorbing all the seagrass facts.
Like sort of a stealth
Yeah.
message.
We had a lot of little things like that because, like, for example, that Jillian had said to me that she and Effendi was another side. So I managed to get persuaded to go on stage. When they sometimes interviewed by the press, and he's an expert on dugongs. They tell the press that he's a dugong. Everyone goes towards Effendi rather than, and kind of ignores Jillian because nobody's interested in seagrass.
So I'm a bit ignorant. What is a dugong? Perhaps Jillian, as the scientist, can tell me.
Dugong, we call it the sea cow. And the reason we call it a sea cow is because it eats grass, it grazes on seagrass in the same way like you would see cows on land grazing in the pastures. So the dugong is a marine mammal. Most people in outside Southeast Asia would be familiar with the manatee. So the manatee is very similar. They're cousins. It's just that their tails look a little different. So imagine a manatee, but maybe slightly smaller and swimming in warm tropical waters and feeding on seagrass.
The word dugong is a Malay word, and it's actually the official scientific word of dugongs. Effendi on first, actually, during the show, to tell the story about dugongs, and then end with, and they eat seagrass. Segue into the next piece, which was Jillian. Then we put the dugongs to sleep for a while. They only sleep for very few seconds. They do sleep, and they have this extraordinary thing where they sleep for like micro sleeps, and then they feed, and then they sleep, and they feed. And they have to keep going out for air every 5 minutes. Oh God, it's all coming back. All the scientific facts that I learned. And Jillian, whenever she spoke about seagrass, you could see that the passion was just there. It's absolutely it's part of her just as much as the gamelan is part of her. And she's extraordinary when you see her playing gamelan, it's something else as well. But the passion of the seagrass, I had not seen before. So she had to be on stage. There was no question of that. We wanted Jillian on stage.
And what has the reaction of audiences been?
For me, the major take home, most people said they didn't expect to come and hear gamelan performance and to go home so much more wiser about seagrass and to have learned something. You know, it's very rare that you actually to go and see performance nowadays. You really need to learn something from it and to actually have a different outlook on life afterwards.
I was so apprehensive at first because at first our ticket sales were not really great because people said it's a show about seagrass. Like, what? We had one audience member who came in and asked to be seated next to the door because according to him, this is a show about seagrass. How good can it be? So he wanted an escape plan. I'm glad to say that person stayed on until the end. I wanted to really know what impressions the audience had. For the first time, we actually did a social survey. After every show that we did, we asked audiences to fill in a social survey form where they could give us their feedback, but also so that we could quantify how much seagrass knowledge they had learned and what they thought about the different elements. That was the scientist part of me, because I wanted to be able to report that as impact for this project. So it was great because actually 82% of the audience said they had very high increase in seagrass knowledge before and after the show. The remainder, I'm assuming there were people who already had a lot of knowledge about seagrass and what we had to say to them. They already knew. This were probably my scientists and conservationist friends who are all already quite expert in seagrass. But 82% for me, that was a big score for us. 70% of them actually wrote down the personal conservation actions that they were going to take for seagrass after the show. So many of them said that they would start donating to marine conservation NGOs. Many of them said that they would offer pro bono work, for marine conservation NGOs who are doing work with seagrass, people who were in a position of power to give funds. And apparently they tried committing funding towards seagrass conservation after watching the show, although they had not been interested in seagrass conservation before that. They were interested in other things like mangroves and coral reefs. So that was also a big win. We also tracked social media, and one there were lots of fantastic quotes from people, but one quote that really stood out to me was this person said, "You do not have to be smart to watch this show, but after watching this show, you will be smarter." And to me, that's it. Yes, it's not just about the music, or the performing arts. It's also about learning about it. And people actually said on social media that they remembered the facts about seagrass better than they did from scientific conferences. So they liked this way of communicating about seagrass science better than they did other, more conventional methods. 95% of our audience actually said that they wanted to see more performing arts events with environmental content.
Wow, that is super exciting. And it speaks to the power of music, dance, creative arts, storytelling to bring these issues to the forefront of people's awareness in a really connective way, in an inclusive way that brings all these different people from different parts of Malaysian society into this mission to save the seagrass. Now, I understand that you had a number of performances in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. What next for the production?
Only did 6 shows. That's not a lot for a huge production like this. We feel that we would like to restage the show and are looking for funding for that. But more than that, we would like to take the show to areas outside Kuala Lumpur, areas like other states in Malaysia where they have seagrass meadows and there are issues about the lack of conservation measures for seagrass meadows. So we've had lots of invitation from concerned citizens in other parts of Malaysia who actually want us to go there to perform so that they too can continue getting the word out about the need for seagrass conservation. So yes, definitely restaging outside the capital of Malaysia. We also hope to go beyond the stage because Seruan Setu is not just about entertainment and not just about music. We wanted to make an impact on policymakers and on the perceptions of policymakers. So the other thing that we've been doing is we've been engaging with policymakers, like in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, for example, to talk about coming up with educational materials for school children and the public that are related to the content of Seruan Setu.
Zahim Albakri, from your perspective, what have you personally gained from doing this project?
Every time I spoke to Jillian, I'd learned something new. During the process, every time I spoke to her, I'd ask her more about it, and then she'd tell me another thing, and I go, really? I would learn something else about seagrass and go, well, we need to put that in, Yeah, so the process was really enriching in an extraordinary way. Rarely do you kind of as a director, work on a production. You come out of it with so much more enlightened in a way. So thank you, Jillian.
Jillian Ooi, what would you like our listeners to today's podcast to take away from our conversation?
Well, firstly, seagrasses are amazing. Please go out and find out more about seagrass ecosystems if you don't already know about them. They're critically important, but the fact that they don't get enough media attention and they're just not out there enough, it's put them at great risk, actually. So the statistics tells us that we lose seagrass meadows the size of 2 football fields every hour. And it's mainly because people just don't know very much about them. Mangroves and corals receive 3 to 100 times more media attention than seagrass. So that's part of the problem. So please, God, and find out more about seagrass meadows. Approach your local NGO who's working on seagrass, wherever you may be, to introduce you to this really magical ecosystem. That's one. The second thing I'd like the audience to take away is we often think that science, conservation, nature conservation is the domain of scientists and policymakers. That's not true at all. As a scientist working more than 10 years in this field, I can hold all the most sophisticated scientific facts in my hands, but if I don't communicate that effectively in a way that touches people's emotions, then it's not going to be much use. And the arts can do that. So arts practitioners, they're really powerful allies in what we're trying to do with conservation. So I think those of us who work in nature conservation, we need to make sure that arts practitioners are at the table with us. And I'd like to really see scientists reach out to arts practitioners to get projects going together that can help modify people's behavior and change their perceptions so that people really get invested in nature conservation.
I was speaking with Jillian Ooi and Datuk Zahim Albakri. There are credits, photos and links to some of the things we talked about on the show notes page. Go to metrowild.co.uk and search for Seagrass. The views expressed by my guests are entirely their own and do not necessarily reflect my views. This podcast is part of the larger MetroWild magazine-style blog. Go to metrowild.co.uk to find a bunch of articles featured there all about city life and wild nature. If you enjoyed this conversation with Jillian Ooi and Zahim Albakri, there are other episodes on the MetroWild podcast. Staying with art and the natural world, have a listen to artist Chris Otley talking to me about his etchings and photography of wildlife and industrial structures. That's in episode 5. You can also try episode 4, where I talk to Jillian Ooi, who is related to me. She's my cousin. She's also the founder of EA Sustain, the festival about environment, culture and entrepreneurship. I hope you will follow the MetroWild podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify and Audible. It's free. New episodes will then appear in your pod listening app as soon as I release them into the wild. A handy link to find the podcast is podfollow.com/MetroWild. The link to the full MetroWild multimedia magazine again is metrowild.co.uk. You can also like the MetroWild Facebook page at facebook.com/MetroWildUK. MetroWild is also on Instagram and YouTube as @MetroWildUK. I'm Yang-May Ooi. You can find me on social media with my personal handle, which is @TigerSpiritUK. The Podfollow link again for this podcast is podfollow.com/MetroWild. Thank you for listening and see you again soon.